Well, thank you all so much for coming out this evening, and thanks to Bill for the invitation and for that really lovely introduction. I also want to thank John for all his tech support over the last couple of weeks to make sure that this runs smoothly. So fingers crossed here. You very likely came here today to hear about a book called Mr. William Shakespeare's Comedies, Histories, and Tragedies, i.e. the First Folio. Published in 1623, 7 years after Shakespeare's death, it was the first large format collection of his plays. 18 of the 36 plays printed in the volume, including Julius Caesar, Macbeth, and The Tempest, had never been printed before. Without this book, then, these plays may have been lost forever. The First Folio is not a particularly rare book, as far as these things go, with 235 copies surviving from a print run of about 750. But the textual history of the folio, how the text it preserves relate to the plays as they were performed in Shakespeare's time, as well as to other print versions that were circulating in the period, has obsessed bibliographers, editors, and Shakespeare scholars. Copies have been highly sought after by prestige collectors, and every time a previously unknown copy comes to light, there is as much speculation about its monetary value as there is about what it might teach us that's new about Shakespeare. So Jason and I are definitely going to discuss the copy of the First Folio at the Free Library of Philadelphia, the one that has recently made international headlines for its direct connection to the poet and near contemporary of Shakespeare, John Milton. This is not technically a newly discovered copy, a point I'll come back to, but Jason's identification of Milton as the book's former owner and reader is revelatory. With that said, however, I will begin somewhat more modestly, with two playbooks that rarely count as authorized Shakespeare because they were printed so long after his death, but which are a kind of linchpin in our ability to read, quite literally for the first time, Milton reading Shakespeare. So imagine this. The year is 1637, maybe it's 1636. The publisher John Smethwick has already invested a good deal of capital in the publication of Shakespeare's plays. Not only did he help to underwrite the publication of the First Folio, which came to press in 1623, but he also stuck around to help fund another edition of Shakespeare's collected plays in 1632. But Smethwick had actually been in the game of selling Shakespeare long before the plays were rounded up into collection. So in 1607, 30 years before this crucial date that you're all holding in your heads, 1637, perhaps 1636, Smethwick acquired from the publisher Nicholas Ling the right to publish 4 Shakespeare plays, including Romeo and Juliet and Hamlet. Smethwick went on to publish 2 quarto editions each of Hamlet and Romeo and Juliet, all of which certainly sold out. Although the expensive second folio has been in circulation for 5 years already, the last time Hamlet and Romeo and Juliet were made available in standalone form was almost 15 years ago, around the time the First Folio came to press. The market for printed plays has bifurcated since then. On the one hand, new titles are being published, but not really finding their way into second editions. On the other hand, a canon of classic plays, including these 2 by Shakespeare, is beginning to consolidate. Sometime before 1637, Smethwick decides it's high time to publish both Shakespeare titles again. Instead of lifting the play text wholesale from previous quarto editions, or even from a newer second folio, he acquires, perhaps through commission, edited versions of the previous quartos to serve as copy texts for his new editions. As Sonia Masai has shown, this practice of anonymous, silent perfecting was fairly typical as plays went into second plus editions. What this means is that the quartos of Hamlet, and even more so of Romeo and Juliet, that Smethwick puts on the market at the end of the 1630s, differ from the folio text and introduce readings of key passages that diverge even from previous quartos. Smethwick announces these changes on the title pages of the new playbooks. Romeo and Juliet was newly corrected, augmented, and amended, while Hamlet was, quote, newly imprinted and enlarged according to the true and perfect copy last printed. But we, who have a synchronic view of these plays' textual histories, have always had a hard time taking Smethwick's claims seriously. After all, the same claims appeared on the second editions of both plays and on every subsequent quarto. It's tempting to read their presence on the title pages of Q5 Romeo and Juliet and Q5 Hamlet as hollow marketing ploys or stale, lazy holdovers from previous title pages. But to readers encountering these playbooks in the late 1630s and 1640s, these declarations of textual novelty and improvement carried weight and truth. One such reader, we now know, was John Milton. Based on what he wrote on the pages of his first folio, we know that Milton had access to these slim, updated playtexts. Indeed, by 1637, Milton was just 1 degree of separation from Smethwick, having contributed a commendatory poem about Shakespeare to the 1632 second folio. How and when Milton acquired copies of these quartos is not yet clear. Just as Smethwick was preparing the new editions, Milton was retiring with his family from the London suburbs to the more rural Horton, where by the end of the year he would have composed his famous encomium Lycidas in memory of his friend Edward King, and also mourned the death of his own mother. Aware of Milton's interest in Shakespeare, and perhaps understanding Milton to be in possession of the older 1623 folio, Smethwick may have posted these quartos to the countryside, an invitation possibly for Milton to perfect the by then outdated folio. It is also plausible that Milton acquired the playbooks sometime after he returned to London in 1639, following his year-long career-altering trip to Italy, either through Smethwick or by browsing the bookstalls in person. His letters also show that he often borrowed books, so he may never have owned these quartos, but rather accessed them on loan. Whatever the itinerary these books took to land in Milton's hands, the fact is that he held them, and they, with their promise of textual improvement, semantic play, and future use, held him too. For over a decade, the exact copies of these small, unassuming quarto playbooks that Milton once held have held me too, but I have not held them. I know them only through Milton's hand, through the incomplete records of his reading practices that remain on the pages of his folio. I am, like Smethwick was, 1 degree separated from John Milton, having held and touched and eyed and studied and collated with great patience and intensity. How virtuous, how privileged to have had the time to do so, this copy of this other book that bears witness to Milton's reading and rereading of Shakespeare. Jason, who, as he'll tell you, is and will likely remain 2 degrees and an ocean removed from getting his hands on the folio, will lay out the case for Milton as the annotator and former owner of this book, and propose some of the implications and applications of this attribution. But for the next few minutes, I want to introduce you to this quite remarkable object, its provenance as far as we know it, the kinds of readerly interventions on its pages, and what its binding tells us about the dates of those reader's marks, independent of, but entirely consistent with, the Milton context. The Free Library's copy of Mr. William Shakespeare's Comedies, Histories, and Tragedies entered the historical record when it came up for auction on Tuesday, July 11, 1899. Quote, a remarkably beautiful copy, as every leaf from the verses to the last page is in a genuine state as it was originally issued. There are a few manuscript notes, and the prologue to Romeo and Juliet is added in a contemporary hand. The seller was not named in the auction catalog, but it was later reported that the copy was owned by the Belroche family, then living in Belgium for over 100 years. So the Belroches made a nice little sum on the sale, as it was auctioned to Bernard Buchanan McGeorge of Glasgow for the record price of £1,700. Sidney Lee, McGeorge allowed the critics and Shakespeare biographer Sidney Lee to examine his, quote, prize for a census of first folio that Lee was preparing. In a preliminary account of the folio published just after the auction, Lee said he felt, quote, no small satisfaction in being the first to call the attention of the literary public to the discovery of a perfect copy of the first folio. MacGeorge sold the folio, perfect because it had all its original leaves, along with copies of the second, third, and fourth folios, to American book collector Marsden J. Perry in 1905 for approximately 3 times what he had paid for it. Lee praised Perry's great venture and remarked that the folio stood, quote, to become the most expensive, absolutely, of all printed books. Perry sold off his Shakespeare collection at a reduced price to A.S.W. Rosenbach in in 1919, but the folio did not end up, as did much of the collection, in the hands of either Henry Clay Folger or Henry E. Huntington, Rosenbach's two main customers. Instead, Rosenbach sold it in the same set of 4 folios to the Philadelphia-based art collector and bibliophile Joseph E. Widener. In 1944, following Widener's death, his son and daughter bequeathed the set of folios to the Free Library of Philadelphia, where Widener had donated many incunabula from his personal collection and had served on the Board of Trustees. Rosenbach called the gift, quote, most fitting, given that, quote, Philadelphia was the place where the first collected edition of Shakespeare was published in America. Lee's sense of the book's value upon first appraisal was based not only on its status as one of very few perfect copies to survive in an intact early binding, but also of the, quote, ambitious literary character of the extensive and varied scribal notes and marks on its pages. This was a book, Lee claimed, that had been, quote, studied with close attention and intelligent appreciation many years before the plays fell under the sway of the professional editor and commentator in the 18th century. So Lee counted some 40 textual emendations in the entire book. I have counted 3 annotations, 121 emendations, 2 substantive additions, and 603 marginal brackets. And I anticipate this number shifting a bit as Jason and I go back through the volume in the coming months. Indeed, the marks are so copious, appearing in all but the Henry VI plays and Titus Andronicus, that the most recent census of first folios, published in 2012, gives up recording instances of marginal bracketing about halfway through the book. Lee insisted that the book had never, quote, never suffered any kind of restoration, and Rosenbach claimed it, quote, existed in its original binding, but both were incorrect. The book acquired its current model dark brown calfskin binding in the second half of the 17th century, and probably no later than 1710. This is a boon for us, since it establishes a terminus ad quem for many of the reader's marks. Because marginal emendations and inked brackets around passages of interest were cropped when the book was rebound, they had to have been written before that time. There is no extant catalog of Milton's personal library, which was dispersed later in his life and after his death in 1674, but it seems reasonable to assume that whoever took ownership of the folio at the time had it rebound. Indeed, its new owner may have been a member of the very same Belroche family that put the book up for auction in 1899. After all, the Belroches were among the French Huguenots who settled in England for a time after the Edict of Nantes was revoked in 1685. This is purely speculation at this point, but the dating of the current binding works with the transfer of ownership around this time. 3 other notes give us some context for dating. Situated above Caliban's speech about cursing in the Tempest, a cross-reference to Volume 1, page 35 of Samuel Purchas's Pilgrims, published in 1625, provides an earlier limit. A printed marginal reference to the Devil Setebos on page 35 of the first volume of Pilgrims, where Purchas reprints Richard Eden's translation of Magellan's Voyage to the South Pole, attests to Milton's accuracy. The note anticipates the next earliest identification of Eden's translation as Shakespeare's source for the name by over 100 years. Another reference to folio 72 of Surrey's Sonnets, aka Songs and Sonnets, aka Toddles and Selene, next to the Gravedigger Song and Hamlet, corresponds to several editions printed long before the folio. While that tells us that Milton had a copy of Songs and Sonnets to hand, the 16th century imprint of this book doesn't help with narrowing the date of the note. Finally, the stanza of Mariana's song that Milton adds to the last page of Measure for Measure may have been sourced from the 1639 quarto of John Fletcher's The Bloody Brother. However, the version of this poem as it is transcribed in the folio varies in enough significant ways from the song in Fletcher's play that it is equally, if not more plausible, that Milton copied it from one of many contemporary manuscript witnesses. So now that we know that the reader was Milton, we might be inclined to agree with Lee that the changes Milton made and proposed to the text of Hamlet and Romeo and Juliet are, quote, doubtless due to native and unaided sagacity. Except that most of the emendations were not unaided at all. In fact, they actually show Milton reading the folio through the lenses of the 2 additional books he had to hand, those 7. My own collation of the folio text with all known early quartos reveals that Milton was collating the folio text of Romeo and Juliet against Smethick's perfected quarto. The same is probably true for Hamlet. In the case of Romeo and Juliet, 37 of the 39 emendations correspond to Q5, and the 2 that don't correspond were not sourced from any other early text of the play. In the case of Hamlet, 28 of the 32 changes have a basis in Q3 and Q4, and 27 have a basis in that 1637 Q5. But if we know that Milton had Q5 Romeo and Juliet to hand, it is likely that he also purchased Q5 Hamlet at the same time. Milton actually refers to his quarto of Hamlet, inscribing a phrase vide supple or vide supplementum, probably see the supplement or see the supplied, next to a passage in the folio Hamlet that is missing 4 lines which appear in the very same speech as it is printed in the quarto tradition. And as Jason recently discovered and will discuss, Milton used this phrase elsewhere to direct attention to supplementary reading material. Milton uses the quarto text to tinker with meter and correct errors in the folio text of these 2 plays, but in many instances he records what I would call provisional emendations and lets the corresponding folio readings stand. So while the friar in F1 sees Romeo giving up on his happiness, he is misshaped, deformed for giving up on his relationship with Juliet, Milton's collation of this passage opens up the possibility of a Romeo who broods over it. He is misbehaved for pouting upon the situation he's created. And this one here is my absolute favorite. F1 gives us a Juliet who anticipates her own sexual pleasure on consummating her marriage. At dusk on her wedding night, she imagines when I shall die, where death is synonymous with sexual climax. Milton suggests, inspired by Q5, that she might also focus on Romeo's pleasure when he shall die. Another great one here, in F1, Hamlet insults Claudius's impotence, the blunt king, in contrast to a quarto-sanctioned reading in which the prince accuses his uncle of having an insatiable sexual appetite, the bloat king. These suggestions show that Milton was not just reading to note and or extract salient passages for other uses, although the brackets throughout the volume show that he was doing that too. He was also immersing himself enough in the fictive worlds of the plays to assess the viability of variant readings. The resulting interventions illuminate, but do not necessarily resolve, the interpretive potential of key passages. This means that the folio, despite its prefatory insistence on its own textual authority, was crucially not the last word on the Shakespearean text. So it's clear that Milton used the quartos prosthetically. The folio needed to be supplemented. However, in a couple of instances, Milton exercises editorial autonomy. Consider Angelo's warning to Isabella in Measure for Measure that hidden beauty elicits more attention than beauty openly exhibited. These black masks proclaim an Enfield beauty 10 times louder than beauty could display. Milton chafed at the adjective Enfield, offering enshrined as an alternative. All folio editions of this folio-only play print Enfield, as do most editions from the 18th century onward, where it is glossed as shielded or concealed. This is Shakespeare's only use of the word, and it is the only usage recorded in the OED. Milton's suggestion of enshrine preserves the idea of protection and concealment suggested by Enshield. As such, his considered choice of this word shows a very early instance of someone with literary sensibility grappling with an abstruse Shakespearean neologism. As Lee esteems the suggestion, enshrined was, quote, a better epithet than any other that has been proposed. So perhaps the most striking intervention in the whole book is the addition of the prologue to Romeo and Juliet, not printed in the folio. In my recently published analysis of the reader's marks, that is the essay that inspired Jason's realization that this reader was actually Milton, I attributed the prologue to a different, earlier reader than the one responsible for the emendations, brackets, and intertextual references. The addition of this text very likely does predate the marginal brackets, at least, since the reader, as you can see, responsible for those brackets, also bracketed the handwritten prologue. And when we try the Milton context on for size, it actually fits. Even though this hand looks different at first glance, it is plausible that Milton is responsible for it and the other marks. His handwriting shifted notably in the late 1630s, around the time of his Italy trip. Among other changes, Milton transitioned from privileging the epsilon E, evident in the prologue, to the italic E, evident in the emendations. This makes it possible that Milton indeed copied out the prologue to the play he called Juliet and Romeo at an earlier date. So the recent flurry of media coverage about this copy of the first folio assumed that Jason and I had discovered this book languishing in obscurity, when in fact the book has been known and in many ways well documented for well over a century. It is described with varying degrees of detail and accuracy in a number of reference works. It is true that the book had never attracted sustained scholarly attention or analysis before I wrote about it. It was not cataloged until early 2018. The reference to Milton was added in September, nor has it been digitized yet. Furthermore, it is housed in a public library that, despite its impressive and well-stewarded rare book department, is not typically frequented by scholars working on early modern literature. Still, the book has been seen, touched, and used in other contexts. The Free Library's curators have been caring for it and using it in teaching sessions for years. In fact, I first encountered the book when I visited the Free Library as part of my graduate coursework in 2007. Of course, when Lee first announced the discovery of the book in December 1899, he called its existence, quote, unexpected. The recent discoveries of first folios at the Jesuit College in St. Omer, France, and on the Scottish island of Bute in the last few years have been equally unexpected. So here we are today, expanding the knowledge of this known copy to a broader audience to highlight not the fact of its existence, but rather the identity of its annotator. Unexpected, indeed. As a scholar, you can only hope that when you run up against the limits of your own capacities, that someone with different frames of reference, different ways of seeing, will move your scholarship in unexpected new directions. So here we are, me and Jason, an ocean apart, and yet joined since September 9th, 2019, by an object that contains histories of reading, rereading, and literary engagement that we are only just starting to get a handle on. Thank you very much.
Great. So, as Claire has said, this was not really a discovery or a discovery of something that was hiding strangely in plain view, but crucial to the identification that started to kindle in my mind as I ate my falafel sandwich in the university library in Cambridge one day last September was not just the detail of Claire's analysis, but also the fact that she had documented her sleuthing with no fewer than 28 photographs from the Free Library folio.
I'm just going to get rid of this little mini window, which we don't need.
Yeah.
Okay.
So Claire thus allowed us for the first time to actually see the annotations that are hiding in this copy, and I think that visual engagement is really crucial. Before we got to Tweetery, it was the digital revolution, the widespread availability of digital cameras, and the strange, newfound, and miraculous willingness of rare book librarians to allow the taking and sharing of digital images that made it possible for me to wonder whether I hadn't seen that hand somewhere before. The verbal annotations in this folio on which we focused thus far are not extensive. Probably they amount in total to around 230 words, most of them reproduced in Claire's article. But those words were enough to awaken the visual memory of somebody who regularly bores his students by showing them a copy of the early drafts of Adam Unparadised in the manuscript of Milton's drafts in the Wren Library at Trinity College, Cambridge, using the widely available facsimile. Some of you will be familiar with those early plans for Paradise Lost. So then I went away and started doing some cross-comparison and set out the paleographical evidence in a series of tentative proposals on the Centre for Material Texts blog. I now think, looking back, that the evidence was less in individual letter forms, which I was focusing on, and more in the overall feel of this hand, the neat separation of each letter form. This is someone who doesn't really do joined-up writing, and the pronounced but controlled rightward lean. I think I should also, retrospectively, have made more of the letter S, which often seems to break down into various forms of unrounded unevenness, as though it presented a small challenge for Milton to execute it. I really need a laser pointer here. I don't know if I can find a good S for you. I think there's there's something interesting going on with Milton's S's. Can you see a good one? That's here, this kind of S which is sort of falling away uneasily. All of this is really deferring an apology for the fact that I still haven't made the full and detailed paleographical defence of this ascription that I know I need to make. but my conversations with hard-hat Miltonists, card-carrying Miltonists, including Will Poole and David Lowenstein, has confirmed my sense that the details do fit with what we know of Milton's hand, including various shifts which take place in that hand and in the mode of annotation. So a shift from the asterisk to the cross for marking changes, which takes place at some point as yet undetermined in the mid-1630s, and a shift from an epsilon form of E to an italic E, an Italian form of E, a modern form of minuscule E, which took place around the time of Milton's visit to Italy in 1638-9. In the absence of that full paleographical analysis, I want here to draw attention to because I'm still anxious about this ascription in various ways, although it's been taken entirely for granted here. I want to draw your attention to the overlap between Milton's annotative practices in this folio and in the handful of other books, I think 8 volumes in all, that survive from his library. So here, this is just to compare a passage from the Trinity manuscript with the hand in the folio. And here you can see the early asterisk, this is the early asterisk and the epsilon E at the top in Macbeth, and the allegedly later cross and the italic E in Hamlet. So actually this is kind of interesting from the point of view of dating these annotations. Here he is cross-referencing as promised by Clare, so you can see how the Vide Supplementum in his Hamlet is of a piece with his instructions in his commonplace book, in the British Library. Actually, I was just looking at a CD-ROM version of the commonplace book this afternoon that amusingly this Vide de Bonis Ecclesiasticis, he has a heading which is avarice, and then he says C, cross-references to the goods of the church. And in his Euripides, at the bottom now in the Bodleian. Here also from his Euripides is his use of an F as an abbreviation for fortasse, perhaps, to indicate that an alternative reading might have been intended. And you can see there Hebona for Hebenon has this same F mark at the point where old Hamlet's ghost says he was poisoned with juice of cursed Hebenon in a vial, and here Hebona is another reading culled from the quartos. Finally, this is my favourite example. We might turn to the folio text of Measure for Measure in the Philadelphia folio, where the Duke asks the jailer to bring them to hear me speak where I may be concealed. Milton recognises that the words are back to front, so he adds numbers beneath the words to indicate how they should be rearranged. 4, 2, 3, 1, 5. In other words, bring me to hear them speak where I may be concealed. Very arduous way of noting, but the same strategy is used in the Trinity manuscript to reorder both single words and whole lines. So you can see till she lose quite becoming till she quite lose by the addition of 2, 1 underneath the words. And you can see 2 lines being reversed, wrapped in a pleasing fit of melancholy to meditate my rural minstrelsy, by adding 2, 1 in the margins in one of the Trinity manuscript drafts. Such minute details, I hope, are beyond forgery, and they point to the continuity of Milton's practices here with the modes of reading and writing that he employs elsewhere. Meanwhile, and happily, Milton is also ready with marginal lines and brackets in other books that he owned. Usually markedly less ready than he is in the folio, but nonetheless still ready. So here's a selection of marginal wiggles from Heraclides' Allegoriae in Homeri Fabulas de Diis, 1544, now Illinois, along with the marking that he makes at the side of his own transcription of the Romeo and Juliet preface on the right-hand side. So to think about how this volume shifts our sense of Milton's interaction with Shakespeare, I think we need to move on from the amazing and extraordinary editorial markings that Claire has been showing us so far, and to think more about these non-verbal annotations, the lines, the brackets, the other swoops of the pen, with the occasional underlining of a phrase, which now become, I think, some of the most gripping marks in the volume, and it's kind of symptomatic that I don't really have a name for these marks. Bill told us all a long time ago what a manicule was. Now he has to give us the authoritative last word.
We're
on a marginal swoop. So as Claire has said, there are just over 600 of these marks for us to sift through. It's quite an enormous body of material, and this can only be a rough figure because the poet frequently marks a few lines with a short bracket and then extends it again and again in a kind of marginal cumulus as the page continues to engage him. And here I think I see a face in the clouds around the point of the barge she sat in Antony and Cleopatra. Some pages are very heavily marked, and on a few occasions Milton adds horizontal strokes at the top of columns of text, apparently to indicate that by this point he was engrossed in everything. So here he is reading Lear, where he's actually, this is the storm scene in Lear. He's getting very excited, and at a certain point you get a kind of horizontal mark there, which looks like maybe just an accident. He spilt his drink. It would be water, I guess, not wine. Then, as one moves on, you find that he's adding lines to the top of columns, seemingly so there's a mark, you can see this up, 2 marks at the top of each column. There are these kind of scorings, which I think indicate that he is just, he's kind of lost the ability to differentiate what's brilliant about the scene on the blasted heath. And here's another page a little further on. Scratchy lines at the top of the columns, again indicating this kind of generalised interest. When you find these kinds of marginal markings, these kinds of brackets and swoops in early modern books, it's easy to write them off as either too predictable, as telling of a kind of rather straightforward sort of commonplacing, or as too idiosyncratic and personal to be decoded. And that problem is often exacerbated by anonymity. I don't know who this reader is, how am I supposed to know what they're reading for? So very often you find yourself, if you're a historian of reading, you find yourself compiling detailed kind of analyses of where the marks in the margins are, and then you take them home and you sort of draw a blank with them. When your reader is Milton, it feels as though we have to push on these non-verbal interventions quite hard to struggle to read Milton reading Shakespeare. It's no news at all that Milton was a fan of Shakespeare. His earliest printed poem, dated 1630 and published anonymously in the 1632 second folio, speaks of wonder and astonishment at his predecessor's achievements. But the Free Library First Folio appears to allow us a glimpse behind the scenes as one great poet reads and responds to another. In some respects, Milton's style of reading in this folio does resemble that of his contemporaries. We know that he kept commonplace books. We have one surviving commonplace book, albeit with lots and lots of blank pages, as I was discovering this afternoon. My CD-ROM was taking about 10 seconds to load each page, and there's another blank page eventually emerges. We know that he kept commonplace books, and his reading here clearly grows out of the notebook methods that were promulgated in the early modern classroom. His marking of short passages that express familiar ideas in unusual ways testifies to, I guess, a kind of generalised love of wit and eloquence. He also, though, has a very striking eye for grand set-piece speeches, those arias in which one character seizes the stage and stills the action. So many of Shakespeare's most celebrated long speeches get marked out, including Our Revels Now Are Ended and Ye Elves of Hills in The Tempest, the Queen Mab speech in Romeo and Juliet, which I think I have for you here. You can see this very neat sort of straight line in the margin down the edge of Queen Mab, which is actually rather similar to some of the other markings that he makes of these kind of set pieces. All the world's a stage, and As You Like It, I Know You All in 1 Henry IV, There is a Willow Grows Aslant a Brook in Hamlet, and as I showed you earlier, The Barge She Sat In from Antony and Cleopatra. We have to forgive him for his failure to mark To Be or Not to Be, and Oh Romeo, Romeo. He also, I think, omits the This England speech, the John of Gaunt speech from Richard II. The ease with which Milton was able to predict the future anthology pieces perhaps merely points to the way in which those speeches are tailored for excerption, are written with extractive readers in mind. But the precise nature of his interest in these passages remains a matter for speculation. It could also have something to do with their fluency, what L'Allegro calls linked sweetness, long drawn out, and the Epistle to Paradise Lost, the sense variously drawn out from one verse into another. Or perhaps it is their vividness, that force of evocation that the rhetorical tradition called energeia, that grips him, rather than some generalised sense of greatness, of great writing. Sheer force of evocation may also be key to Milton's marking of many other passages that relate to time. What have I got here? Some of these concern recurrence, as in full 30 times have Phoebus' cart gone round in Hamlet, or 4 days will quickly steep themselves in night in A Midsummer Night's Dream. I think it's quite interesting that he marks this kind of archaic bit of Hamlet that sort of sounds like a bit of Midsummer Night's Dream that's fallen into Hamlet, that gets a kind of a mark. More often, the reference to time is sharply particular. So on the morning of the Battle of Shrewsbury in 1 Henry IV, the king observes how bloodily the sun begins to peer above yon busky hill. The day looks pale at his distemperature. After the murder of Hector in Troilus and Cressida, Achilles comments that the dragon wing of night o'erspreads the earth, and stickler-like the armies separates. And Milton marks both of these passages and many others like them. He's particularly sensitive to dawn and the crepuscular twilight that precedes it. Any excuse to use the word crepuscular. He brackets the argument between the conspirators in Julius Caesar about the time. Here lies the east, doth not the day break here? Romeo and Juliet's debate about the same question. It was the nightingale and not the lark. And the rather more troubling O Bard from Troilus and Cressida. O Cressida, but that the busy day waked by the lark have roused the ribald crows, and dreaming night will hide our eyes no longer. I would not from thee. It actually is morning. And I'm off. Early modern rhetoricians would have placed these descriptions, I think, in the category of chronographia, which George Putnam's The Art of English Poesy, 1589, labelled the counterfeit time, saying that examples are everywhere to be found. What's been striking to me is how many examples are everywhere to be found in Milton's early poetry when you go from this book to early Milton. To turn from the folio to poems such as L'Allegro and Il Penseroso is to notice how those poems are built around descriptions of day turning into night, turning into day. And the cock with lively din scattering the rear of darkness thin. In the light of John Guillory's analysis of Milton's debt to Shakespeare, we might speculate that this fascination with the dawn is peculiar to a poet who senses himself to be on the threshold of his immense career, or of a poet who wants to cling to pagan imaginings, even as the clear sun of revelation is dawning. The restoration of a second stanza to Mariana's song, this is L'Allegro. You can see the larks taking flight. You can see the cock stoutly strutting his dames before. So the restoration of a second stanza to Mariana's song, which we saw earlier, points us to another of Milton's preoccupations in the folio. He marks almost all of Shakespeare's songs, despite the fact that they are already set apart from the text, usually in italics, and he also notes numerous references to music. The first 6 lines of Twelfth Night, if music be the food of love, play on, receive a scratchy bracket, as you can see here. And Milton not only marks the song sung to Orsino, come away, death, on the right-hand side, but he also marks the very beguiling preamble, the spinsters and the knitters in the sun, and the free maids that weave their thread with bones do use to chant it. One of the few annotations to The Two Gentlemen of Verona picks out a reference to Orpheus's lute, strung with poets' sinews, which could make tigers lame and huge leviathans forsake unsounded deeps to dance on sands. A slightly more lively leviathan than Milton usually produces himself. The interest in music comes together with an obsession with dawn in 1 Henry IV, where Milton brackets the passage in which Glendower's wife offers to sing the song that pleaseth you, and on your eyelids crown the god of sleep, rendering the hearer dimly conscious, as in the hour before the heavenly harness team begins his golden progress in the east. Milton was, of course, the son of a published composer. He was a close friend of the musician Henry Lawes, and he was himself a performer on the organ and bass viol. So this musical preoccupation fits, although the programmatic nature of the marking may take us rather by surprise. It is a bit like he's compiling sort of anthology through his annotations of musical moments. Actually, I could expand that a little. Another interesting thing is that he very often marks in sort of poems embedded in the text as well. So It's not just musical text. One could go on, probably for a long time, multiplying examples of Milton's enthusiasms in this volume. So he seems to be repeatedly drawn to descriptions of the natural world, whether it's the homely folkloric idylls of flowers and nature spirits, or the violence of storms, thunder, and lightning. Here I've got a mini anthology on the theme of sedge, coarse, rush-like plants growing in muddy places, which Milton picks out at several points. He does just seem to have a little obsession with the sedgy banks of the River Severn, or just a lot of sedge going on. You may recall the appearance of Camus, the personified river Cam in Lycidas, footing slow, his mantle hairy, and his bonnet sedge. Milton also but perhaps there's more to be said about the nature of a sedgy stream as a source of poetic inspiration. Milton also delights, it seems, in the supernatural, the eldritch, and the horrifying, ghosts and witches, portents and prodigies. Here's a page from, here's some more, yes, there's Camus. Here's a page from Macbeth, thunder enter three witches, where hast thou been, sister, etc., with an absolutely enormous marginal swoop. I don't know if you can see it, sort of starts at the top and just kind of cruises down to the end of the interlude. Hamlet's ghost scenes are also thickly marked, and various other supernatural intrusions get the same treatment. Several of this annotator's concerns also seem suited to the future epic poet, so he notes the portrayal of martial heroism, of vast heights and depths, and of movement like Ariel's that is quick as thought. The history of reading has always insisted that reading is not a passive reception but an active appropriation, and this volume fully bears out that claim. So Milton's reading of Shakespeare is very partial and notably serious. He has almost no time for clownage. I think he's reading the comic stuff, but he's not marking it. He tends to note very little in the comic plots of the play. So, for example, he skips all of the brothel scenes and the courtroom scenes in Measure for Measure, and he ignores Sir John Falstaff pretty much entirely until the old king dies and the fat knight deceives himself into thinking that the laws of England will be at his commandment. So he only notes Falstaff when he gets his comeuppance. This reader values earnest, fervent speech and elevated thoughts. I'm sorry if I'm producing a rather Miltonic sounding Milton here. The poet, who was in his youth noted for high-mindedness and strict sexual morality, may also be guilty of some prudishness in these pages. His love of song, for example, does not extend to the master, the swabber, the boatswain and I, a raucous sea shanty from The Tempest, or to What Shall He Have That Killed the Deer, a song about cuckoldry from As You Like It. But it would be easy to overstate this case. Milton marks out and perfects the whole of Juliet's speech of erotic yearning for Romeo, as we've seen, gallop apace, you fiery-footed steeds. Have I got that here? Yeah. And he relishes some of the sensual indulgence in Antony and Cleopatra, perhaps a model for the intemperance of his own Comus. And we should not forget that the supplied second stanza of Mariana's song is about breasts. So take, oh, take those lips away is followed by hide, oh, hide those hills of snow which thy frozen bosom bears, on whose tops the pinks that grow are of those that April wears. So there is something, there's a kind of openness to eroticism, at least if it's in musical form. My discussion of these annotations so far has, I think, or my analysis of these annotations as far as I've got, and I feel like I'm chasing after them, has extended Clare's initial sense that this reader was densely engaged with Shakespeare's imagined worlds, as suggested by the provisional collations in which he opens up possibilities rather than shutting them down. And I think these annotations also open up worlds of interpretative possibility in themselves. I just want to sort of walk through a sort of train of thought, a kind of what I'm going to bill as a sort of rather nebulous train of thought prompted by some sort of rather, kind of nebulous annotation. This kind of, these clouds, these billowing clouds in the margins. So take the notes around Ariel's song, sung invisibly to Ferdinand, come unto these yellow sands. Milton bracketed the first 4 lines, then the next 2 lines, Then he added a separate bracket for the lines "Hark, hark, bow, wow, the watchdogs bark, bow, wow, bow, war." He also underlined the watchdogs bark as if struck by this strange detail. It's hard to believe that there were many watchdogs on that fictional island, but again, the reference evokes the world just before the dawn. There is an obvious link from this passage across to the Ode on the Morning of Christ's Nativity, composed in 1629, in which Milton stole a rhyme from it. So Shakespeare writes, "Curtsied when you have, and kissed the wild waves whist," imagining spirits silencing the waves by kissing them. Milton, describing the pre-dawn silence on the morning of Christ's birth, writes that the winds with wonder whist, smoothly the waters kissed, whispering new joys to the mild ocean. This is not just a matter of filching an unusual rhyme, it suggests an absorption in Shakespeare's imagined universe, but more than that, an absorption in the sound and the feel of his lines, which Milton, I think, hears and intensifies. Having caught that echo of the Tempest, you might hear an equally powerful echo 30 lines further into the Nativity Ode, when the shepherds who sat simply chatting in a rustic row are visited by the divine, when such music sweet their hearts and ears did greet, as never was by mortal finger strook. Divinely warbled voice answered the stringing noise, as all their souls in blissful rapture took. This is the angelic chorus sounding on Christmas, the first Christmas morning, the morning of Christ's birth. But it's an angelic chorus which I think is being remodelled along the lines of Ariel's invisible music, those kind of sounds in the earth and air. Shortly after this, in the poem, a globe of circular light appears to the shepherds, in which the cherubim and seraphim sit harping in loud and solemn choir. And to read the ode alongside Milton's other markings in the Tempest, which cluster particularly thickly around the culminating wedding mask. So here he is annotating the mask, and it's quite interesting because he's not at all interested in Ferdinand and Miranda's courting, but as soon as you get to the mask, and the cloud-capped towers and all the rest of it, suddenly he's kind of hyperactive in the margins. So you can see all these marks as Ceres and Juno and the rest of them are doing their stuff. So when you read the ode alongside these marks, I think you start to suspect that the Nativity Ode itself is a kind of mask, a succession of scenes which is being staged, managed by this enchanter poet. Thinking along these lines, we might track forward to other early works, including Lycidas, the processional, mask-like nature of which is more obvious, and to Milton's own actual mask, staged at Ludlow Castle in 1634, now usually known as Comus. In the plot of Comus, Milton turns the Tempest on its head. His evil enchanter is a version of Prospero, and the virtuous characters are forced to restage Caliban's insurrection, storming his lair and disrupting his magical power. So the shape of the early play is clearly haunting Milton's imagination throughout, and the beauty of Ariel's disembodied fairy music is, I think, ringing in his ears. At one point in the Trinity manuscript, drafts for Comus, Milton even has to change yellow sands to tawny sands in order to hide the extent of his indebtedness to Shakespeare and to that song. This is just one of the points in Comus where you can see he's trying to repress the Tempest. The Tempest is sort of so much. So come onto these yellow sands. It's like he's got a copyright on it in his mind, I think, and so he rejigs, he reconsiders. That kind of nebulous trail of thoughts, which I've just tried to sketch out, the way that the sort of force field of the Tempest and the force field of some of Milton's early writings interact, is a train you could well have pursued without the free library folio. But Milton's annotations in the volume, I think, offer a kind of heat map of his responses that might slowly begin to reshape our sense of how this relationship worked. I'm aware that what I've offered here has been, as like the annotations themselves, somewhat cloudy and numinous, whereas Claire's able to kind of go in there and say, yes, this is 1637, and this is for definite. Here we're in a kind of real realm of speculation. I've been assuming that we are dealing with the pure receptiveness of open-ended reading as well, an assumption that perhaps runs counter to the purposiveness, the end-directedness that historians of reading tend to want to find in marginalia in the wake of Grafton, Jardine, Sherman, Sharp et al. Is there a real distinction here, or is Milton just as purposive as everyone else, turning to Shakespeare for perhaps a particular kind of vernacular literary education? Much, I think, will depend on dating, for if, as seems likely, these annotations mostly date from the later 1630s and early 1640s, then it's likely that we're dealing here with rereadings rather than first readings. And the question of where the re-engagement fits into Milton's very calculated development as a writer is going to be central. Along the way, we'll probably want to know if we can detect the radical of the 1640s rather than the experimental poet of the 1630s in any of these annotations. We'll also want to know where the folio can fit into the broader ecology of Milton's prodigious reading. Where on earth are the rest of his books, and do any of his quartos survive to tell us about his further engagements in the margins? So as soon as you find this book, you sort of immediately start to think, well, isn't it ludicrous that we only have 8 or 9 surviving books from this library? Something clearly has gone badly wrong in our literary sleuthing to date. Finally, on a personal level, I want to know if it's possible to do material texts research at arm's length. Before I came across this book, I'd signed, with one of those sort of slightly pointless kind of carbon saving pledges. I'd signed a pledge not to fly in 2019 and 2020, and I suspect that I'm not going to want to take the practice up again in 2021 if I can avoid it. So I'm wondering, is it possible? Is it okay to do material text scholarship at arm's length in collaboration without actually touching the book, without holding the book, without sharing the hand? Whatever the answer to this welter of questions, I think the Free Library First Folio offers us a splendid opportunity to reopen the file on one of the most significant relationships in literary history. Thank you.